As for the other front plate detailing, the tank features some of my usual Sherman detailing, which would include the little canister, which would be used for the headlight plug, the tarpaulin clips found on the machine gun clip ring, as well as your usual welds, which are found on all the brush guards themselves. Another modification made to make the tank Israeli was that of the tank's siren. On the original American version of the Sherman, there is a small siren that is contained in this caged brush guard in this location here. However, like I mentioned in the other Israeli video, one modification the Israelis made was that they removed the siren and in its place replaced that with a nightlight. The blackout or nightlight that we have here is the East Coast Armory version and is made out of resin. The brush guard itself is the standard Tamiya brush guard. However, I went ahead and removed the center cage apparatus, which was also done by the Israelis. Another modification that the Israelis made that I made to this tank was I added the sheet metal cover for the brush guard mount itself. This little rounded guard here is standard and is a dead giveaway that the tank was once in Israeli service. A new addition to the EastCoastArmory.com product line is that of this Israeli-style grab handle. All Israeli Shermans feature this grab handle here, which is mounted on the front galoshes plate, and the purpose of this device is that it helps the crewman get up into the tank from climbing aboard from the front hull. The component is made out of resin and is a simple drop-in install. Sculpted weld beads were added in order to help the look. Moving our way to the top deck, first we'll start with the engine deck. The engine deck is one crucial area of these Israeli Shermans which needs to be modified in order to successfully have the tank represent Israeli service. All Israeli tanks featured the replacement of the stock engine with that of the diesel. To do that, the Israelis also have to modify the top deck in the pattern that you see here. The top deck that you see on this tank here is the resin set from EastCoastArmory.com and is representing that of the early pattern style Israeli Shermans. The later ones featured a different setup in this location here, which featured a different exhaust manifold as well as different layout of grill work. To install this new engine deck, you need to first amputate the original Tamiya kit molded in one. This here is easily done with a tool like the Multimaster, in which you can just plunge cut around the seam and the panel will just pop out. Once the panel is removed, the ECA version is dropped directly in. Also added to the ECA product line is that of the Israeli early pattern M50 travel lock. As you see, the travel lock is fully functional, and this is the very early version of the M50 mount. The later ones featured a different strap apparatus in order to mount the gun in place. This version here is actually modified from the American unit by the Israelis and featured the American style locking mechanism, which is found on the opposite side of the travel lock. All these details are present and are found on the East Coast Armory resin version. Our way forward takes us to first the grouser cover locations. The intake itself, they are molded into the Tamiya kit and are nicely done. One quick modification I made though was the addition of some photo etch brass mesh work. The mesh was added to both sides and also helps with the look of the model. Like I mentioned before, the tools are all stock Tamiya. One tool, however, I had to scratch build was that of the pry bar. This kit component is missing on the Tamiya kit and was a simple addition. I went ahead and fabricated out of wire and 2 pieces of Plastruct plastic. Also moving on, we go here to the drainage locations. These locations here or these small little holes here are missing on the stock Tamiya kit and are also, again, a simple addition to make that also greatly helps the look of the model. In addition to the holes, I also went ahead and added the mounting levers or the pull pins, which are here found on all of the fluid filler caps. Moving our way on the model takes us to the bow hatches. The bow hatches are the stock Tamiya units and are integrally molded into the top deck. One modification I made was the addition of scratch-built brush guards, as well as I went ahead and added the missing handles that we see here. All components are made out of small pieces of wire and are all hand assembled. The brush guard was also fabricated for the loader's hatch, which is found here on top of the turret. Moving our way to the tank's turret. The tank's turret had to have been heavily modified, as this is one area on these Israeli tanks that they also had to heavily change around. First, starting with the smoke grenades. The smoke grenade launchers that you see here are a new addition to the East Coast Armory product line. They are in a set of 4 and contain all the details that you see here, with the exception of the sculpted on weld beads. They have their hollow backs to them, their clamp detailing, and also come with the wire for use of the retention chains, which would be found on the actual tanks. The smoke grenades are a mirror image on the opposite side of the tank. Moving our way to probably one of the most important mods needed to make this tank an M50 is that of the rear bustle counterweight. One modification that the Israelis had to have made was that when they equipped the tank with a French 75mm high-velocity gun, the extended barrel, as well as the cramped conditions inside the turret, required for them to extend the rear portion of the turret by amputating the stock bustle bin. The unit was then replaced with an Israeli-designed pattern. This version that you see here on this model is a new addition to ECA. The East Coast Armory version is made out of cast resin and features all the detailing that you see here, including all of the rough cast texturing, the locations for the antennas, the rear blower, the M10 style lift rings, as well as the wire utilized to make the wraparound grab handle. The grab handle that you see here was all bent and then was soldered in place. The soldering makes for a nice robust piece of detailing that can hold up to the rigors of radio controlled use. To install the ECA unit, again with the use of a Dremel Multimax or Multimaster, you go ahead and amputate the original Tamiya rear bustle. Now you only remove the rear bustle on the top portion of the turret. Keep in mind, the Tamiya turret is comprised out of a top and bottom half. The bottom half bustle is left as was done on the Israeli tanks, and only the top portion needs to be removed. Once the top portion is removed, the ECA unit should just drop into place. Located on the top of the bustle is that of the antenna bases. This tank features the ECA flexible resin MP65, as well as the ECA MP48. The MP48 is also a dual purpose on this model, is that this model does feature a conventional older style radio, which needs an external antenna. The RX antenna is actually wired through the MP48 and blends in seamlessly with the detailing. Moving our way to the turret itself, first takes us to the M2 HB. The M2 that you see on this model here is your standard Tamiya 1/16 scale M2, and it's a nice piece. Like usually on these rebuilds, the 50 grab handle on the barrel was broken and a new one was fabricated out of wire. And also, like on all of my M2s, I went ahead and drilled out the muzzle of the 50 caliber, which is missing on the stock Tamiya model and also helps the look of it. Another new addition to ECA is that of the retracting Sherman pintle mount. The pintle mount that you see here is a new resin drop-in addition and replaces the M4 105 mount that we have here. Keep in mind, if you're building your tank as an M4 105, you leave the extended and overhung 50 caliber pintle mount as it's needed because of the extra blower which is mounted on the back. If you're working on a non 105mm Sherman, then this mount is required if you have the late style Commander's copula like we have here. A common scratch build piece I've seen on other people's builds is that they assemble this piece or they fabricate it, but a lot of people misunderstand how the height of the unit, and the gun is always standing up way too tall. This unit here is scaled correctly to give you the proper height of the machine gun on the Sherman. Also, as of a side note, you can see that all the welds have been sculpted on, and the weld in this triangular portion here was actually that of where the original overhung 50 caliber mount would have been present, because this was originally a 105mm Sherman. Once the Israelis modified them, they took an angle grinder to the piece, removed it. However, the welds still remain from the original unit. Also, moving our way to the hatches are stock Tamiya and are fully functional. In the loader's hatch serves two functions. This is where the main power switch is, and it's also where the tank's recharge jack is. Like on all of my 1/16 scale builds, I really don't like the idea of having to remove the tank's upper body or turret in order to constantly recharge the battery, as once it's fully detailed can cause damage. So the recharge jack was built in. You simply pry out the recharge jack. You can now charge the tank without having to take apart the model. Once the tank's fully recharged, you simply stuff the wiring back into the model. And once it's stuffed in, you are now ready to operate. Moving our way to the commander's copula, the main hatch was modified to be fully functional. And the reason for that is because you have a Tamiya battle unit that is fitted to this tank. With the hatch functional, you simply open up the hatch, plug in your infrared unit, and you're off to the races. Moving our way to the front of the turret, first stops us at the vane sight and the guard box. Vane sight is stock Tamiya, however the guard box is on this one made out of a wire brush guard. These wire style brush guards were a common field modification made to Shermans during the war, and may have still been present on the Shermans as they entered Israeli service. So it gives for a nice little unique detailing, which is not typically found. Moving from there takes us to the tank searchlight. The searchlight that we see here is that of the EastCoastArmory.com resin unit. What's unique about this searchlight is that it serves dual functions. It acts as a detail element, but is also the IR emitter for the tank's battle system. The searchlight is a perfect place to conceal and hide the IR unit, as if left exposed does really hurt the look of the model. The unit's wiring was modified to flow through this location here and enter into the tank in the same location that the real power cable of the searchlight would have done the same. One mod I made was I went ahead and added heat shrink tubing to the Tamiya wire in order to have the cable as one cable as opposed to two stranded loose wires, which is found on the Tamiya unit. By concealing the cable in the heat shrink tubing does also greatly help the look of it. Moving on from the searchlight takes us directly to the tank's mantlet. The mantlet is probably the second most important modification made to this tank. The mantlet that you see here is 3D printed and was acquired off of Shapeways. The vendor is also the same vendor that I mentioned earlier about the other Israeli modifications, including the side storage bins. The 3D printed parts are very nicely made and were a very easy mod in order to hook it up to the Tamiya system. They're highly recommended. However, the components did require a little bit of fitting and tweaking in order to make them be a little bit more accurate. As you can see, the unit here has its cast texturing present, as well as the edges are all rounded off. On the original 3D printed mantlet, all these components here are squared off and are smooth and are void of any cast texturing. Also added are the two Phillips, or the two slot screws, which are found on the top portion here of the what would be the rotor mount. The mantlet itself, the triangular mantlet, also needed to have its edges rounded off, as again, everything was all squared away and pointy, and on the real Shermans, these were casted and had a rounded off appearance. Cast texturing was also added to this component here. To mount on the searchlight, I went ahead and fabricated a bracket out of brass, mounted it to the 3D printed mantlet, and went ahead and added the sculpted weld beads. The sculpted weld beads both help with the accuracy of the model, but also give structural support to the component. Moving to the gun and muzzle of the tank, starting with the muzzle. The muzzle is a 3D printed component from the exact same vendor who made the other components. The muzzle is highly detailed and is highly recommended with no needed mods required. As for the barrel is not included with the set. However, the barrel that you see here is an aluminum barrel from Shumo and is actually intended for the Panther. Now, it might sound odd in putting a Panther barrel on this tank, but keep in mind the French high-velocity 75mm gun, which the M50 had, was actually a product improved derivative of the Panther 75mm gun. So the use of this gun barrel on this tank is actually very similar to what the Israelis did. The Shumo barrel had to have been modded though to fit into the 3D printed component. Featured a little bit extra material in this location here in order to fit into the Panther mantlet. In order to modify it to fit into the Sherman, I went ahead and turned the aluminum barrel on the lathe, removing the required material necessary in order for the barrel to fit nice and snug into the Israeli mantlet. Now, this tank here does feature the photostrobe flash, however, does not feature any recoil, so the barrel is in its fixed location. One other feature that this tank has that makes it different from the other Israeli tanks that have been represented over the years is that of the tank's coloring. Rather than going with the standard desert tan or Israeli armor sand, which is typically found on most Israeli tanks, this tank here is actually painted with a green. The coloring that this tank is painted in is what would be called French olive drab. The reason for this is that, like I mentioned before, after the Israeli War of Independence, Israel was acquiring military equipment and vehicles from all over Western and Eastern Europe. One of the countries that they were able to acquire a large amount of munitions from and aid from was actually France. The French, they were able to acquire some Shermans as well as the 75mm guns. The Israelis were also able to acquire several large quantities of the French paint, and at the time the French were using this shade of olive drab. Israeli tanks would have been painted with this color again in the late 50s into the early and mid 1960s. Until then they were phased, this color was then phased out with that of the Israeli armor sand and desert sand, which we've all come to know. Moving our way to the markings, all of the markings on this tank are applied by hand and are painted on. No decals were used, as the hand application greatly helps the look of the and accuracy of the model, as the real Israeli tanks had their markings applied in the exact same manner, and it's not uncommon to see Israeli tanks of this time period with very crude and rough applied markings. This is done with all of the identification markings, the ID numbers, chevrons, unit division markings, as well as barrel markings. And now we're going to take the tank for a test drive. Before I do that, let me first turn on the radio, and I'm going to turn on the tank. Like I mentioned earlier, the power switch is located in the loader's hatch. Now, like I mentioned before, the model is function-wise stock Tamiya. This stick here does all the driving, while this stick here does all the animations. Left and right for the turret. Gun down and gun up. Toggle down. Machine gun. Toggle up. Recoil and And that concludes this model showcase video for this 1/16 scale radio-controlled Israeli M50 Super Sherman. If you like this video, stop by and like us on Facebook. And don't forget to check out eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thank you.